So today I'm going to give you a very, very broad introduction to boa constrictor genetics. I get asked questions about genetics a lot, probably happens more than anything else at shows when I'm there. People asking questions about boas. It almost always kind of comes back around to questions about genetics, how it works, you know, what will I get if I breed this with this? And it can be very, very confusing. So this is going to be kind of a broad overview of what I'm going to do in a series on boa constrictor genetics, which literally will probably be about 40 videos. 40. So you need to stay tuned and watch this because I'm going to give some very, very specific things that you can look for in trying to identify what you think might be a mutation. There is a big difference between a mutation, which is a single gene controlled characteristic, and a polygenic anomaly or difference in the norm, or what you would call, science would call, wild type in boa constrictors. So polygenic means there are many genes that control the visual aspect of whatever it is you're looking at, thinking it may or may not be a mutation. So you need to drill down to prove if it's a single gene mutation or to find out if it's just a polygenic mutation. So this happens a lot. So that's part of what we're going to go over, and I'm going to go over some very specific things that I look for after having done this for 40 years and identified a number of mutations and helped other people identify even more mutations and keying them in on what to look for, what specifically is important. So you need to try to have a keen eye. Some people have a gift for it, but everyone can improve their own ability to look at and identify certain characteristics that may or may not be an indication of a specific single gene mutation. And I'm going to give you some things that you can look for that'll help you in that process going forward. But I also want to kind of do an overview of the kinds of mutations that there are and the mutations that I'm going to be going over in my series on boa constrictor genetics. This will take me a long time. It'll be about 40 videos. So stay tuned to the end because you're not going to want to miss these little tidbits because I'm going to drop them throughout the video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over each of these different mutations very, very briefly that I'm going to be covering in the future. And for each one, I'm going to give the history. That is, who produced the first one? Where did it come from? Was it an import? Was it something that somebody produced themselves? Was it something that someone produced very deliberately, having identified or seen something in an animal that they picked up from someone else, or an animal that they produced themselves and saw that, hey, there might be something here, and then work toward proving that? So I'm going to do that for all the mutations that I know anything about, and which is most of them. So I know most of the players, if not all the players in all of these different mutations. I was around when they first popped on the scene, and I just have a really good knack for remembering, approximately when it happened, within a couple of years of when the first one appeared, who produced it, and sort of what was the result of that animal being produced and what happened going forward, how successful was producing that particular mutation to the whole boa community and to our hobby. So I'm going to go over those things. It should be fun. I'm going to enjoy doing it because I love talking boas. So anybody who knows me, seen me at a show, know that I just love to just stand there and babble boas all day long, which is what I do. So a lot of people don't know this, but the first boa constrictor mutation that appeared on the scene was one of two, or three. So I'm not sure which one was truly the first, But our first mutations that we identified occurred in the 1980s. So one of them, or maybe two of them, may have occurred before I started breeding boas, which was 40 years ago. 1986 is when I had my first litter. I obtained my first boas in 1984, and it was 86 when I had my first litter in February. So in about 1984, Gary Bagnall, who owns ZooMed, a gigantic reptile supply company, sells to millions of people all across the country and thousands of pet shops. And he served as president of USARK, was a huge donator to USARK. We would not have our hobby today if it wasn't for Gary Bagnall's financial contribution and his brain power to help USARK succeed, especially in the earlier days. Gary Bagnall was importing a lot of animals before he started ZooMed. So he was a reptile guy, really pretty much a turtle guy. Turtles are his great fascination. But he had obtained a group of 5 albino boas from Colombia. 4 males, 1 female. So how many of you knew that? Probably not a lot. I don't know that I've ever seen it in writing. But there were 4 males and 1 female. He obtained them from Colombia, on an import. They were importing a lot from Colombia back in those days. And they came to the country and they sold to a big boa breeder in Nebraska. No, that wasn't it. He didn't sell them to a big boa breeder because there weren't any boa breeders. I mean, there were probably a few people that had some baby boas, mainly in Florida, who would get in something gravid. They'd have a real big fat boa came in and they'd hang on to it until it had babies, and then they'd have babies. So there was nobody really breeding boas with any regularity. The first one that I knew of that was breeding boas, who I had met on the phone in about 1990, was Sharon Moore. And at the time she lived in either Louisiana or Alabama. She was breeding boas. I'm not sure what year she had her first babies, but it was about the same time that I had my first babies. And when I had my first babies, I didn't know anybody else that bred boas. And she was breeding boas, and she had a pet shop, so she was selling them in her pet shop. And she had the first captive-born mutation boas, and that was Boa Woman Carmel. Now, they were renamed Boa Woman Carmel, I believe, by Big Mike when he had obtained one early on in the 90s. So he told her that she ought to call him Boa Woman Carmel, because she was just she didn't have a name for him. Nobody named everything back then. Like now, you make a boa and you think it's got one more saddle than it should, you give it a new name, the McGillicuddy boa, or I don't know, it's kind of crazy out there. But she had made these boas, and she called them light phase, and it was a T positive. We didn't know what T positives were at the time. She had sent me, I'm going to see if I can find that quick, so hang on, I'm going to let this run, and through the magic of video editing, I'm going to come right back. So the other day, when I was looking at my notebook and talking about how I'd figured out the length of the gestation period in boa constrictors, I found in this notebook a letter that I'd gotten from Sharon Moore back then with some pictures. Back in the olden days, they used to have cameras, and they had inside the camera something that was called film, and you took the film to a photo processing center or mailed it in. They would process that and make it into pictures, print up pictures, and you get these paper things. They were pictures. They weren't on your phone because you couldn't take a picture with a phone. So I stumbled onto that when I was in my notebook that's going to go in the Jeff Ronnie Museum someday, that had all my my breeding data, which I showed you. But I just stumbled onto this letter, and I didn't look to see if I could see the postmark on it at the time. But let's see. So it was November 27th. November 27th, 1992. Sent to Boa File, where I used to live in Apple Valley, from Sharon Moore, Louisiana. So she sent me this letter. She was called, her pet shop was called Peaceable Kingdom. See, this is real. This is real history. And that is one of the very first light phase T-positive Boa woman caramels to have been born, which Sharon Moore was producing. So Sharon Moore she had a very large cage. It's basically made a room into a cage. And she sends me this letter. It says, enclosed are the pics of my light phase boas. Sorry, so slow. Holidays make for a rush. We'll send trading pictures later. Probably after the holidays because of sanity, Sharon. So, I mean, this is real. It's real stuff. So I hung on to it. So at any rate, first one. You know, I'm just going to let the at any rate fly. I'm just going to let it, it's a natural thing for me. So if at any rate bothers you more than it bothers me, because it really doesn't bother me, you're just going to have to get over it. So she sent me that, and I talked about it. I didn't know what a mutation was. I mean, I had heard of albino boas by then. Pete Call had been breeding them and made some hets by the time we obtained this, but I didn't really understand what was going on. Didn't know anything about T-positives. Wasn't in the vocabulary. Didn't know how to make mutations, how to find them, blah, 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 blah. So that's sort of how first time I talked about or knew of Boa woman caramels. So she was breeding them and producing them sometime in the 80s. In about 1984, Gary Bagnall got these imported albinos, and he didn't sell them to a boa breeder. He sold them to some colubrid guys, 4 colubrid guys in California and Washington. So Ernie Wagner, I'm not going to remember now, and 3 other who at the time were very successful colubrid breeders. So at that time, there were a lot of people breeding colubrids. Colubrids were more popular than anything. There was a smaller group of people that were very interested in pythons because pythons were breedable. They'd kind of figured out how to breed pythons. I don't know if the first albino berm had come in by then. Possibly. Very late 80s. Steve Osborne was another one. John Ruiz. Then there was one more. Yeah, I don't remember his name. I think Ernie Wagner is still alive. I'm pretty sure he is. He's a Vietnam vet, so he'd be in his 70s, maybe 80 now. So that's kind of be generally. These are older guys. But they obtained them. So 4 males and 1 female. I'm just going to give you a little bit of history on this and specific to give you kind of a glimpse of what I'm going to do in these other videos going forward, as I start this series. So they obtained these boas and they bred them, or they were trying to breed them and they couldn't breed them. They were 4 or maybe 5 years old and 6 or 7 feet, and they weren't getting any breeding activity. So they let the word out that they wanted to sell them. And so I don't know if some of them had died, that I don't know. But I know that Paul Miles, who was the next door neighbor of Pete Call, bought the first one. So Paul Miles bought a male. And then pretty shortly after Pete Call bought a male, and they partnered and started breeding them together, as a partnership, not the males together. And Pete had probably the scaliest thumb, probably the best boa breeder ever. Produced the first het for albino boas with those two males that he and Paul Miles had obtained. And the first litter of hets was produced, I believe it was 89. It was either 89 or 90. I had gotten some from that year and the year after from Paul Miles. And the rest, as they say, is history. So that's kind of a glimpse into what we're going to do going forward. So there are a lot of, they were call albinos, which weren't produced until the 90s, but the first import was obtained in like 84, 85. So they were identified, so people knew they existed. And they were also getting in regularly through Florida. They were getting in lots and lots of Colombian anarthristics. Later on, much to my irritation, they started calling anneries type 1 anneries. There's no such thing as a type 1 annery. There are Colombian anneries, period. They aren't type 1. They're Colombian anneries. Now, the Central American anneries, when they started coming in, okay, you can call them type 2 if you want to. But for this old boa breeder, Colombian anneries are anarthristics. They're not type 1. They didn't become type 1 until sometime years after they started calling the Central Americans type 2. Then they decided, well, I'm going to start calling the real annery, or the regular anneries, Colombian anneries, I'm going to start calling those type 1. So that's how that happened. So that's a little history on that. So those were the first three. So Sharon Moore was producing Boa woman caramels, and calls were coming up, but anarthristics were being imported regularly and were identified by the importers. So the first person that I'm aware of that bred and produced anarthristics was a guy named Glenn Carlson, who's still alive. He's in California. He's an older guy too. He's in his 70s. So I don't want to give too much history on too many of these mutations until we really get into it more. But that's some of what we're going to do going forward. And what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about there are three primary modes of inheritance when it comes to mutations in boas. Is that right?
So I ran out of storage on the phone. I had to delete some stuff. I've got 512 gigs on that thing. I had it filled up with video and stuff. Old video, so I just deleted a bunch of that so I could come back. So I'm not sure where I was, but I want to talk a little bit about the three main types of specific genetic mutations that there are. So there's a simple recessive mutation, which is controlled by a single gene. Incomplete dominant mutation, which is controlled by a single gene, or to be technical, can be shown to be a visual with just half of that gene carrying that particular mutation, or carrying one copy of that mutation. And then dominant, which is similar to incomplete dominant, except that a dominant mutation reveals itself when it is only carrying one copy of the mutation, but it shows itself in an identical fashion even if it carries two copies of that mutation. So let me try to explain. So in the case of a simple recessive, your typical simple recessive is going to occur in the wild or in captivity in a way that you can see it after two animals that are both carrying that mutation get bred together, and then some of their offspring have two copies, that is, both sides of the DNA carry that particular mutation or a copy of that mutation. So now the way that typically works is A mutation is a spontaneous. Mutation is, there's two different things really. So a mutation, you can be referring to a specific anomaly that is heritable, reproducible, that you can see. You can see, you know, hypoboa. That is a mutation. But so that's used as a noun or as an adverb or adjective. Sorry, or an adjective, a descriptor. Mutation can also be used as a verb, so as an action. So when the first of a particular mutation occurs, a visual mutation, the noun version, the first one that occurs, that is a mutation, verb mutation. So the DNA is normal. It's all wild type or a normal looking animal. And then spontaneously, one animal is produced that reveals a new mutation, noun mutation, because of the verb action of a mutation having occurred on the DNA. So kind of an ideal example is the scoria boa. So the scoria boa came from two boas in a pet shop in North Dakota. And the very first one produced was in a litter of about 24 babies. I'm going to give a detailed history of this when I do the scoria video. So one animal was produced, a mutation, the verb, occurred in one of those offspring. And the visual mutation, the noun of scoria, revealed itself. So that particular boa had one copy of the scoria mutation. And you could see it very obviously right from the jump. So that is kind of how it happens. Now, typically with simple recessives, you're not going to spontaneously have a new albino occur where there has been a verb mutation that occurs, and then boom, you see an albino, for instance. That's not how it happens. It's not because those parents bred together and a mutation, the verb version, occurred that moment and you saw an albino. That's not how that happens. The way a simple recessive occurs is both parents already carried a copy of that mutation. They were wild type or normal looking. And when they breed together, they produce a new, or about 1 out of 4 babies that both carry, or that carry two copies of that mutation, revealing it to us when we see it. Or most of the time it occurs in the wild, no one ever sees it. Probably gets eaten up the first day because it's different. You know, it's not as good at being camouflaged. So that is typically how a simple recessive is going to occur. There was a mutation, verb mutation, the action, in an animal sometime before, could have been generations before. And that mutation, that lonely mutation, was in a single copy on that first animal. And then it bred successfully. Half of its offspring carried a single copy of that mutation, but it still didn't appear where anyone could see it until eventually 2 animals that both carried a single copy of that particular mutation bred together, and then boom, the simple recessive was revealed in the offspring that had 2 copies of that particular mutation. That makes sense? So that is always going to be the result of some degree of inbreeding. So that could be son to mother, it could be father to daughter, it could be brother to sister, it could be 5th generation cousins together. But that mutation originated from somebody in the past and was passed on and passed on and passed on until 2 animals that both carried that simple recessive mutation found each other and produced a baby that had 2 copies of that mutation, and then boom, you saw it, simple recessive. So that to me is fascinating to think about. An incomplete dominant mutation is, at this point, like scoria, for instance. So there's a visual that you see in all the offspring that have scoria. They have a single copy of the scoria gene. Now, we don't know if there's a quote-unquote super version or not, and we also don't know if you breed a scoria to a scoria, do you produce some scorias that actually have two copies? Because there are mutations where you could have two copies of a mutation, but it looks identical to an animal that only has one copy. So there's only one example that I know, well, there's two examples that I know of in boa constrictors. So one is the Inca. So the Inca boa is what is called the third type of mutation, as is hypo. It is called a dominant mutation. That is, it reveals itself when it carries one copy in exactly the same way as it reveals itself when it carries two copies. Follow me? So an Inca, if you breed an Inca to an Inca, about 1 out of 4 of the offspring are going to carry two copies of the Inca gene. You won't know it until you breed them because it looks just like an Inca. There is no such thing as a super Inca, what we would call super version. In motleys, a motley is an incomplete dominant mutation. And in the super form, when you have two copies of the motley gene, that is a fatal gene. So that doesn't happen immediately, but if you breed a motley to a motley, you'll get some babies that are all completely gray or completely black. And usually they will die within about 2 weeks, but sometimes they'll linger on for a while. Some people have had them live for a few years. They never thrive. No one's ever bred a super motley. They have a narrower head. And so anyways, I just want to mention that. So that's an example of an incomplete dominant where there is a super form. There are other incomplete dominants where the super form is healthy, and those are reproducible. And in that case, if it's a super and it's got two copies of the mutation, when it breeds to another animal, every single baby that it produces will get a copy of that mutation. So I'm going to go into more of this in videos in the future, but I'm just trying to give you a broad overview at this point. So I'm going to kind of rattle through a list of the mutations that I had written down. Now, I'm not going to do every single thing that people claim is a mutation. I'm not doing any imaginary mutations. I'm only doing mutations that have been proven to be an actual single gene mutation. So there'll be some controversy in that. Some people will say, oh no, this is a mutation. Unless I know that it's a mutation that's been proven to my satisfaction, I'm not going to include it. You can put it on your list if you want to. But for my own credibility's sake, I'm only going to put on mutations that I think actually are mutations. So this is a list, fairly exhaustive list of the mutations that I'm going to be going over and will be including in videos in the future where I'll give individual history, when it first occurred, who produced it, what were the circumstances, and then how do they do. So a lot of people don't know how some of these mutations are not the healthiest of animals. They don't do great. And I'm going to go over that. There'll be some controversy in that. Some people will get mad about that, but I'm just going to give my opinion. And I've worked with all of these on this list that I'm going to give you. I have owned and worked with all of these except for 6 on my list. So I'm going to read my list. So I'm going to be looking down now at a sheet I've got hanging up here. So, call albinos, bow woman caramel, anarthristics, that is Colombian anarthristics, sharp albinos, arabesque, motley, blood, jungle, type 2 anarthristics, Argentine motleys, Argentine T positives, Aztec, hypomelanistic, VPI T positive, Central American T positive, leopard boas, prodigy boas, scoria, Roswell laddertail, fire boas, Inca, Sterling, Key West, Ralph Davis reptiles, black-eyed anery, super marins or marins, the atomic boa, Bacano boa, which is a patternless Peruvian, which I proved out. I proved out some of these other ones too, but I just mentioned that. Raptor boas, IMG, Celtic boas, NFI, and Parsons boas. So that's the list that I put together. If you know of something else, you're welcome to suggest it. If I think it's a legit or mutation, single gene mutation, and not a polygenic trait, I'm going to include it. So I'm going to give you an example of one that I'm not going to include because it's not a mutation. So squaretail. So squaretail was believed to be a mutation. It was beautiful, just crazy beautiful. And squaretail was bred to a normal, didn't produce any squaretails, so it was presumed to be a simple recessive. And then squaretails were bred to a het squaretail. Still no squaretails were produced, or maybe one. Or squaretails were produced later on, and people bred squaretail to squaretail, which I've done, and no squaretails made. So the squaretail is a real visual animal, but it is not a single gene mutation. If it was, and you bred squaretail to squaretail, you wouldn't end up with an entire litter of wild type or normal babies. You would get something. So that's an example of a mutation that isn't a mutation. It's a very cool looking animal. It'd be nice if it was heritable. I suspect there's more than one gene involved, and we just hadn't been able to figure it out. It may be impossible to figure out. I don't know. There are some people that still have squaretails. Maybe someone will figure it out, and we'll come to a better understanding of how that works. But right now, squaretail to squaretail doesn't necessarily result in any squaretails. Squaretail to normal is certainly even less likely to have that happen, but that's one that I'm not going to include in my list. So a lot of times people confuse mutation with bloodline. This is especially true for people that are fairly new in the hobby. For instance, so to pick on my own, so the monster tail bloodline came from a monster tail boa that I obtained from Joel Dubé back in 1997 or so. I bred it in 2000, 2001, and that is a bloodline. That's a very distinct, crazy, beautiful animal, and there's no question that it amps up whatever you breed it into, especially in the early generations. But that is a bloodline. It is not a mutation. So I get people ask me all the time, what are the signs of being a monster tail? Well, the signs of being a monster tail is it was born to an animal that was descended from the original monster tail female. And the farther you get, generation after generation after generation, the farther away you get from the original monster tail, usually the more that visual look or that amped up red color is diminished or diluted. Unfortunately, most people that get an animal like that and they breed it to their biggest animal, it's because they want to make monster tails, monster tail hypos, monster tail whatever, and they're not breeding it to an animal that's worthy of the genetics of that monster tail look. The monster tail look is the result of polygenic anomalies or polygenic characteristics. So polygenic means many genes. So there are many genes in the original monster tail female that contributed to her look. So she had more saddles than you should have. She was very red, had a really, really red tail and really bold, thick, blocky saddles. That was the original monster tail look. Her babies, most of them leaned very, very closely to that. None of them were as good as her, but they were similar because I bred her with a really nice pastel. Pastel is another polygenic trait, not a single gene mutation. Harlequin boa, another polygenic trait, despite the fact we were lied to and told that super that there was such thing as a super Harlequin, which there was not. My phone is ringing. I hope that does not show up. So, at any rate, I'll keep on talking. Maybe I'll edit this out. Another example of a polygenic trait is red rum. So there are definitely people making redder and redder red rum VPIs, but that is because they're selectively breeding them. So if you buy a single red rum that's crazy red, and you breed it to your biggest VPI thinking you're going to make red rums, they're going to be diluted. You're very unlikely to get any that are as nice as the red rum that you purchased, because those characteristics, that color, is diluted by the animal that you breed it with, because it's polygenic. It's many genes in the animal that's really red that resulted in that visual appearance. And when you breed it to an animal that doesn't have the advantage of those many genes that made that animal as red as it was, you, right off the bat, you at least cut it in half. You diminish the way the animal looks. So that's because it's a polygenic mutation. Pastel Dream, same thing. I'm the one who coined the phrase 25 years ago. Pastel Dreams were a couple of bloodlines of animals that I had that had reduced black, that in my mind were very similar to hypoboas, although were prettier. They were prettier than any of the hypos that were being made at that time. But it was not a single gene mutation. I forgot to put my lapel mic on, so this is going to sound like crap. Oh well, sorry about that. I'm not doing it again. So the things that you can look for, here are the specific things you can look for if you've produced a boa that's crazy cool and you wonder, is this a mutation? And I've done it more times than I've been able to prove it. A lot more times. So you produce an animal and it is really special. In your mind, it's really special, and you think that it might produce something. So here's what you look for. I'm going to hook up my mic. All right, the mic is back. So I'll sound better for the last little bit. So if you produce an animal and you think it might be something, or someone else has, or you're walking through a show and you see something that, whoa, check that out, that might be something, or someone is making a claim that this is a mutation, here are the things, the specific things that you can look for that I developed, that I looked for. One of them I didn't. Someone else found. But the other ones, I found them. Two of them I didn't. But a couple of them I did. And these are specific things that I look for that are a glimpse or a hint that it might be a single gene mutation, because these things are very, very uncommon in normal or normal non-mutant boas. So the first thing is look at the eyes. So normally a boa constrictor eye, apart from the pupil, which of course is dark, and then the ocular stripe, which goes this way, which is going to be a little bit darker, because it has to be for you to be able to see it. But the eye, especially above the ocular stripe, typically is about the same color and shade as the skin immediately adjacent to it. So I'm holding my fingers on my own head as if I am a boa constrictor, almost. So you look at the eye. Is the eye different? Does the eye have weird markings in it? I had one that had like a star kiss thing, a star kiss thing going on in the eye. I was never able to breed it to prove it, but I'm sure that that was going to be a mutation. I just know it based on my experience and what I'd seen. It just had that look, and it had a different kind of a pattern. I could see indications in the pattern as well. But I never proved it, so I don't really know if I was right. So the eye is number one. Number two, the mustache. So I'm talking about a single gene, normal looking boa. So you can't look at these characteristics on an animal that's carrying other genes, because the other genes can affect these things. It needs to be
a completely normal animal except for the thing that you think makes it special. So if it's a VPIT positive, you're not going to be able to look at the things that I'm going to list for you as indicators. They may be hints. They're not going to be as strong a hints because the VPIT positive has an impact on all of these things. Follow me? So the fewer other genes in there that there are, the more likely that an anomaly in some of these other characteristics I'm going to go over are an indication or a glimpse into the window that this animal might be some sort of a mutation. The mustache. So boas always have an inky, shiny, glossy, black mustache. The mustache is varying lengths, so sometimes they're wider, sometimes they're smaller, but they always have the black mustache. If the mustache is anything less than inky, glossy, black, that might be a hint. All right? So far, I haven't seen a boa that had a fader than normal mustache, or fader than inky black glossy mustache that didn't ultimately prove to be a mutation. I'm working with a line right now that I'm hoping will prove that it's a mutation. I'm hoping that some of these animals I'm looking at with a pale mustache and some weird eyes, that I'm seeing a glimpse into what's essentially a simple recessive that's going to make a super form, or an animal when it has two copies of that gene going to make something extraordinary. But remains to be seen if that's going to happen or not. But I'm working towards that. Mustache. So the next thing is side medallions. Side medallions, they have a very typical look. It's a little different on Aztecs than it is on normal Colombians, so you've got to take that into account. So side medallions that are extra big might mean something. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Just one of the things you can look for. If there are light scales under the chin, so fire boas, or het leucistic boas, het princess diamond boas, have light scales under the chin, almost always. I can't say that they always do, because I haven't seen that many of them, probably 30. But as far as I know, they always have some light scales under the chin. Now, there are other boas that have light scales under the chin too. Motley boas sometimes do. Bolivian boas, which aren't even Colombians, and there's no known mutations in them, they will have the light scales on the chin. So that's another thing you can look for as a hint that maybe something is going on. The pattern on the head. So most boas have a distinct pattern. So boas that come from, you kind of have to compare it to other boas that come from the same area. So here's an exception. So Central American boas have a more bold head pattern. That's a given. They're just going to have a more bold head pattern. So if you have Central American boa and it's got something out of the ordinary for a Central American, say it's got a really, really thinned out pattern, more like a Colombian boa, but it's pure Central American of some sort, Costa Rican or whatever, that might be a clue that something's going on with that animal. Maybe. Something to look for. In Colombian boas, if the pattern is more like it looks on Central Americans, like an IMG. An IMG has a very bold pattern, more like a Central American. Arabesque boas have a funky pattern on the head with a bold, broad head stripe. That's because they're arabesque, and it reveals itself. So those are some of the things that I've keyed in on that I look for, that you can look forward to looking for yourself. At any rate, that is going to conclude this first video, where I just give you a real broad overview of genetics. I'm going to go into all of this in greater detail, including simple recessive and very specific things about simple recessives. I'm going to give visual aids that are going to help with this in helping you to be able to predict about how many you're going to make of each mutation. There's something called a Punnett square, which I think is too complicated for a lot of people. So I'm going to do this visually in a way that's more understandable. So a Punnett square is something that scientists use. You can add as many different genes to it as you want to if you understand a Punnett square. Then it's very simple for you. If you've never seen a Punnett square, you didn't take advanced biology, you weren't interested in the chemistry, and you're not very good at math. I mean, for most people, the Punnett square, your eyes are going to roll over in the back of your head if I started trying to teach you a Punnett square. So we're not doing it that way. I'm going to do it in a way that's much more understandable to normal people, which I don't count myself as normal in that way, in kind of the normal, non-weird way, but normal enough in terms of understanding concepts. So I'm very good at sort of understanding that and explaining it in a way that makes sense to normal people. And the same thing with incomplete dominant and dominant, though dominant is very rare. So we'll go over all these things, and I've got lots and lots of videos to do. It's going to take a long time. At probably 40 videos on specific mutations and their history, additional videos on simple recessive, incomplete dominant, dominant mutations, and predicting what you're going to get. So we'll do all that in the future. If you enjoy this, make a comment. You've got to make a comment. It can be whatever. You know, I'm George from Pluto. Like the videos. I'm George from Pluto. I wish you didn't say at any rate as much. Or you're really irritating me. I mean, anything you say is going to help the algorithm. And at some point here, YouTube is going to boost us with exposure. We're getting almost a 10% turnover rate when people see the thumbnail, which is a very high reaction. If 10% of your people that see a thumbnail click on you, that's very good, and which is great. But it's not going to really take off until the algorithm picks me up and starts posting me on everybody's page more often. Then it'll really take off. It'll encourage me to do more of this, and I enjoy doing it. I like talking to myself, and I'm good at talking to myself. So if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Make a comment. You can like it if you like it. You can not like it if you don't like it. Whatever. And you can disagree with me all you want. It won't do any good, but you can. And if you think of another mutation that you think I should cover that I didn't mention in my list, add it. I'll see it. And if it's one I haven't heard of, maybe I'll look into it. If I think it's a legit mutation, I'll add it to my list. And I appreciate it because I'm sure that there are some I just didn't think of. And I'm not going to go over ones I don't know anything about. So I'll just leave them out. That doesn't mean if I don't cover it that it's not an actual mutation. It might mean that there are very few of them around, or I couldn't get the information on it. So just want to make that clear. All right. Well, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Have a good one.